Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's conversations on food justice. We are waiting for our attendees to join the session. We're giving it just a few minutes. So we will join as soon as we have built capacity. But again, thank you so much for joining us. We are very much looking forward to today's conversation, having you with us. Good afternoon, everyone. For everyone who has just joined us, we're just waiting a few moments for registration to build. So we will start the session momentarily. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends joining us from Hawaii. My name is Elliot Gaskins, Managing Director of Development at Share Our Strength, and I'm very proud to welcome you to our 5th edition of the Conversation on Food Justice series, our collaboration with Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. Thank you all for joining us today on this call, and also to all of those joining us via our YouTube stream. Thank you to Corby Kummer, Executive Director of Food and Society, who you'll hear from later, and Tracy Anderson for their incredible partnership. And thanks to all my colleagues at Share Our Strength who, through their support and hard work, help make this series strong. Special thanks to my colleague, Julie McNulty, who helped make today's session extra special. 2 quick notes. We want to have some nice interactivity today and hear from as many of you as we can. So please submit any questions or comments you have into the chat throughout. We'll be devoting the last 20 minutes to what we hope will be a very lively Q&A. Secondly, we're also proud to have again Spanish language translation provided by Community Language Collaborative. They will be providing live simultaneous interpretation and chat transcription. You can access audio options by clicking the interpretation icon found at the bottom of your screen, then select your language preference. Gisela and Mardakio, thank you so much for joining us today. Listen, everybody, you know, one of the goals of the Food Justice series is to bring compelling conversations to you that have significant importance. To hear directly from those who have deep expertise, profound lived experience, and a commitment to justice. Today's timely discussion will not disappoint. Today, because of the pandemic, more children and families in Hawaii are at risk of going hungry than ever before. A recent report by the University of Hawaii found nearly half of families with children in Hawaii reported struggling to pay for meals this past March. The good news is that there are many organizations, like some of our Share Our Strength partners on this call, like Appleseed, and all the individuals participating in this panel who are dedicated to supporting families and committed to the struggle for Hawaiian self-sufficiency. We are so excited and humbled that they are with us today. It is now my extreme pleasure to introduce our dynamic and incredibly gifted moderator, Paula Daniels. Paula, a native Hawaiian, is co-founder and chair of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. The Good Food Purchasing program unites stakeholders from across the food system around shared values and strategy. She has received numerous awards and recognitions, including an Ashoka Fellowship and a Resident Fellowship at the Bellagio Center at the Rockefeller Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Paula. Paula?
Elliot, thank you so much. And thank you to the Aspen Institute and Share Our Strength for putting this panel together. It's truly my privilege and honor to have this conversation today, especially with the panelists that we have who are all very well known in their respective fields in Hawaii. Their reputation goes far and wide. So I'm going to introduce them and then provide some context for our conversation. So I'll introduce them in generational order because our conversation will commence along those lines. So first I'll just introduce and then come back to Danny and Mayala Bishop, who are in my generation. We were I'm going to call us the territorial generation because we were born in Hawaii when it was still a territory and not yet a state. It was at a time of peak pineapple and sugar production and export. And it was also a time when much of Hawaiian culture and history was not available, except in conversation with our elders. So Danny and Mayala Bishop. Danny and Mayala are Native Hawaiian rights activists and Native planters. Danny's also a member of Onipa'a Nahui Kalo. They grow kalo or taro on the windward side of Oahu in an area called Waihole. Kalo was one of the canoe plants. The plants our original ancestors brought with them to Hawaii when they first settled the islands well over 8 centuries ago. And then the current generation of leadership who grew up with the Hawaiian Renaissance, Ikaika Hussey, who's founder of the Hawaii Federated Industries. It's a worker-led social enterprise aiming to strengthen Hawaii's economy through projects in decarbonization, food security, and local production. And he's the former editor of Kawaiʻola, which I get regularly. It's a newsletter of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Marty Townsend, an attorney and chapter director of the Sierra Club of Hawaii, formerly with Earth Justice, and she has a very impressive track record in protecting mountains and ocean areas of Hawaii, which some would call the ocean state. And in the rising generation, we have Kaiana Runnels, who's the Mahi Āina supervisor at the Kohala Center. So a bit of translation. Mahi Ai means cultivator of food and land. Aina means land. Kaiana is the Mahi Āina supervisor. So he's what some would call a farmer, what we would call a land steward. The Kohala Center is a nonprofit based on the Big Island of Hawaii that uses research, education, and Aina, land stewardship, working with ancestral knowledge for healthier ecosystems in the islands. So that's our panel that we will turn to. But first, I want to provide some brief context. So as you know, probably tourism and military are the top drivers of Hawaii's economy today. And because of Hawaii's dependence on imports, both the cost of living and the median home price in Hawaii are the highest in the United States. Hawaii is also dependent on imported food and many other products at a rate for food of 85 to 90% imports, even though Hawaii is blessed with famously fertile agricultural lands and was once able to sustainably feed the Kānaka Maoli, the original peoples, at about a population of 1 million before contact. So how did the 50th state get to be in this state and what's being done about it? So we'll touch on these issues in our panel today, but some additional context, 2 key events that are pivotal to modern Hawaiian history that we'll touch on throughout our conversation. One is the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom in 1893, which was preceded by the Great Mahele of 1848, which I'll explain in a second. And then the Hawaii Constitutional Convention of 1978, which we fondly refer to as the Hawaii ConCon. It arose in the context of the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1970s. And a key catalyst in that movement was the first voyage of the Hokulea in 1976, a traditional voyaging canoe. And that landmark voyage traced the original migration path between Hawaii and Tahiti using a resurrected knowledge of Polynesian wayfinding, which is navigating by a knowledge of star locations, wind, and ocean movements. It was a Polynesian innovation developed several centuries before Galileo invented the compass. And proof of the viability of this knowledge was a pivotal moment in reviving pride in our original abilities and their modern value. So I'm gonna touch again quickly, start on the history of Hawaii as a US state, which starts with the overthrow, and that is how our conversation will unfold. And mention that the Great Mahele that I mentioned before of 1848 marked a transition in land ownership in the Kingdom of Hawaii from a stewardship model, where all the lands had been managed collectively for the benefit of the public, to a private ownership model. So this eventually led to the disenfranchisement of the Hawaiian people, because much of the land ended up in the hands of missionary families who were increasing their political and economic power over the islands. And in 1887, they forced an amendment to the Hawaii Constitution to require property ownership as a condition of voting. And by force, I mean quite literally at gunpoint. It's referred to as the Bayonet Constitution. And a few years later, in 1893, those same American missionary descendants participated in an armed overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time was a very sophisticated sovereign nation. They were key players on the world stage and innovative in their use of technology, old and new. Iolani Palace was the home of our monarchs, and it used electricity before the American White House did. Honolulu had electric streetlights before Washington, D.C. did, but then came the overthrow. So I'm going to tell my family story of it and then invite Danny and Mayala to do the same. So I want to acknowledge my great-great-grandfather, William Henry Daniels of Maui. He was Hawaiian English. He was a lawyer, a judge, and congressman representing the Wailuku area of Maui to the Kingdom of Hawaii. Once the overthrow happened, he refused to take the oath of office to the self-installed provisional government, and he was kicked out of his judicial position. Then he was forced to work in the irrigation dishes of the sugar plantations that were booming around that time because of the overthrow, which was the driving force, that driving economic force behind their interest in doing so, the missionary gangs that led that. So then 2 years later, my great-great-grandfather in 1895 participated in a counter-revolution, and he was sent to prison for that. And the generations of Daniels after that lived and worked on the sugar plantations. My great-grandfather built the rail lines for hauling cane. My grandfather was a maintenance engineer at the Punane Mill, which is the last mill, sugar mill in Hawaii. And even my mother's side of the family, they were imported in 1903 as labor for the sugar plantations on Kauai and Oahu. So Danny, Mayala, I learned about what happened to my great-great-grandfather and the overthrow from my grandfather, who told me this family story when I was 10 years old, or after around the dining room table. This was 1965. And at the time, the history of the overthrow wasn't being taught in the schools at the time, not even in Hawaii. How did you learn of it?
Well, thank you for asking that question. First of all, I like to start with my grandmother, pure Hawaiian. She was taken shortly after birth from her parents and raised by the Catholic Church. So the information did not come from her. My father, half Hawaiian, joined the military, veteran. And that there was no conversation about the truth around our dinner table. It started around 1972, or just before that, watching the news, watching the occupation of Kaho'olawe, and meeting a classmate of mine. His name was Duke Alvey, and he started a Hawaiian club in high school of senior year and started to bring up the truth. And when I confronted the truth at my dinner table, in the dinner time with my father, and asked him, what about signing up for Hawaiian homes? What about this? What about that? It was met with great hostility. So it was a struggle learning the truth. It took time, and mostly through the news events and through interaction with people who knew about the truth that I got to this point. And it's been a struggle.
Neala?
I grew up in Hawaii, and during the 60s, when I was in the elementary grades, we still had segregated classes. The Hawaiians were segregated from the rest of the population, who were like Japanese, Chinese, Haoles, and Portuguese people were all in the regular population, but the Hawaiians were segregated in another part of the school. I'm almost half Hawaiian, half English, but they didn't know what I was, so I wasn't put there. But we had something called free lunch. And when I went to the free lunch line, which everybody could see, paying population, free lunch population, well, this is where I met my Hawaiian friends. This is where I met lifelong friends, the Hawaiians. And we had school lunches. They were pretty meager. When I got home from school, my chore was to take a bucket, go down to the ocean, get a bucket of ocean water, bring it back to my mom, who had been gathering seafood off the reefs during the day. And she would use that water to clean the fish and whatever. We would collect sea cucumbers, you slice them, fry them, vana, which you have to eat right there on the spot.
Yeah.
Crabs that you just eat whole, limu or seaweed, which she would pickle, and pickled vegetables were also a very big part of our meal. Down the road was the Captain Johnny Rosa. That's where she got a fish. She would get our aku, ahi, and tuna from the fishermen, and she would use every part of that fish. So along with this fare, we would have what we call poi. Poi is a milled kalo, milled taro. And you mix it with water. It comes into a paste. You put it in a bowl. It ferments over a couple days. Me as a child, I wanted it the first day when it was still fresh. But about 3-4 days, it gets kind of sour, but it's full of, so many things that help the Hawaiian people through the generations. So yes, we would have poi and that kind of fare. And we didn't even have Spam in those days. Maybe corned beef and cabbage. So that was my childhood. Then when I got to be a senior in high school, I was still eating free cafeteria meals. And at this point, there was no distinction. Everybody got in the same line. There was more variety to eat. And so, yes, this was still one of my main meals of the day, was my lunch at Kailua High School. So what kind of got me was 30 years later, I'm picking my mom up from the senior citizens. And lo and behold, if that green tray with cafeteria food for elementary kids was actually sitting in front of her, this is what they fed the senior citizens, the same fare they were feeding the elementary kids in the neighborhood. The same thing to the senior citizens. And I looked down at that, and to me, I was just like, well, now this is my mom's main meal of the day.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing your stories. And I'm glad you brought up the food system, Me'ala, because I actually remember my grandfather, along with teaching me Hawaiian history, taught me how to harvest opihi, which meant a lot of good timing. When the waves come in and off, opihi are little monovalves that cling to the lava rocks in the ocean, and we ate them right on the spot. So at the same time that was happening, Hawaii was the highest consumer of spam in the world, I think, a very high consumer of spam. And a lot of that came from the military occupation, right? The military times in Hawaii. My mother would tell the story of martial law and the fact that they didn't have any food except for what had been imported to feed the soldiers. So Hawaii was under complete military law. The military had taken over the newspapers and the political system and the food system, and they imported all the food, which kind of started off Hawaii's dependence on imported food, right? So we want to talk more about your kalo farming, and we'll come back to that. I'm going to turn to Ikaika and Marty now, and I'll come back to you after we have a chance to talk with Kaiana. Thank you so much for setting the stage here for us. And Ikaika.
Oh, Paula, you're muted.
Hi, how did that happen? How much of what I said did you hear? I don't know how that happened. I didn't touch anything. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Ikaika, so the current generation, the Hawaiian Renaissance generation, and now in leadership. So your work involves labor. Labor also played a strong role in the evolution of the dominance of the sugar plantations over life in Hawaii. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So I would say that Hawaii sort of enters into the American imagination first as a sugar colony, sugar plantation colony, and then also as a military colony. And so in all, as in any situation where there's such a stark dichotomy between the boss, the sugar plantation owner, and the workers, invariably or inevitably, the workers rise up. And it's the same thing that we see happening right now in the United States with the Amazon warehouses. And I think it's one of the most important kind of energies in our society is workers standing up for their humanity, for the full articulation of their rights as workers and as people. And so right now, a lot of my work is as a labor organizer with Unite Here, which is the hotel workers union. And we're in a situation where we have new plantations. Those are the hotels, and those hotels are booming in spite of the pandemic, in spite of a global pandemic, which has threatened our food security. But they're really not willing, or they're quite reluctant to rehire workers as they reopen. And so it's a kind of a timeless story, unfortunately. And it speaks to the critical way of thinking that I see very prevalent in this series of talks. And I really appreciate that Share Our Strength is looking at food from a justice perspective in terms of racial equity. That really power dynamics are really central to any conversation about food or justice in general.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, labor played a big role in increasing worker well-being. In 1946, I remember there was the sugar strike. My dad was in high school at the time, and he had been living in the Punane plantations. They were living and working there. And after the sugar strike, some housing was developed that the workers could purchase, among other things, right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've had it's a piece of Hawaii's history which doesn't get discussed much, but there has been very violent repressions of worker uprisings in the past, in Hilo, on Kauai, and it's an important piece too, because the modern Hawaiian movement, quote unquote, started 50 years ago in Kalama Valley as a coalition of University of Hawaii students coming together to support a pig farmer who was being evicted by Bishop Estate, which is the largest landowner in Hawaii. But there is a much older Hawaiian movement, which was actually the labor movement. That it was all these people who all of them have Hawaiian surnames, who were prominent leaders in our community, who came up through organized labor because they understood that the question of like our sovereignty and our rights as people was inextricably intertwined with the questions of capitalism. So the labor struggle is very critical here.
Yeah, and my understanding too is that it was led in 1946 by Filipino workers, and part of it was that camps, like the ones my dad lived in, were ethnically divided, and the Filipino workers organized across the ethnic divides, which was led strength to the movement, and it started the mosaic of cultures that we have in Hawaii.
Right. I think that's in a lot of ways that should set the a pattern, for how we build community power going forward. It's important that we have our ethnic identities, but for us to forge multi-ethnic coalitions is much stronger.
Yeah. And then you also were editor of Kawaiʻola. So the Hawaii ConCon of 1978 created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which was very important part of the amendment. And the newspaper of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Kawaiʻola, was you were editor of. Can you tell us what the name means and some of the
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the word ka is a great word. It means da. I'm just kidding. And
very ubiquitous, yeah.
But wai is a very important word. That's WAI, and that means water. And in the Hawaiian language, water plays, it's sort of our central thing. The area that Uncle Danny and Auntie Meala live is Waiahole, and actually the streams behind their property. If you don't, Auntie and Uncle, is it okay if I share this?
Please do.
There's an important old story about the mingling of the streams up in those valleys. In our creation chants, which, in spite of the fact that I'm raised Catholic, I still believe in our creation stories, that we're related to these lands. And in these stories, we talk about how the mingling of the Waiololi and Waiolala streams, that was the beginning of life. And that water, wai, is so important. The word for wealth in our language is waiwai. The word for law is kanawai. And so our entire orientation is around how water is distributed. And so many of the injustices have been about taking of water, depriving it from, essentially our native economy, and taking it and moving it to places for sugar and sort of an import or a monoculture economy. And so that's what wai means. And ola means life. And so I was the editor for just a short time of Kawaiʻola.
Well, I'm sure I read your work, and that's a perfect segue, your comment about Waiahole, to Marty. But first, I want to just say thank you, because I remember in the Kawaiʻola newspaper reading about a health column about the Waianae diet that was hoping to get address the cardiometabolic disorders that a lot of Hawaiians were experiencing and move them back to an original diet. And I thought that was a really important innovation. It seemed to be quite successful. So Marty, the Hawaiian constitutional amendments of 1978 were also significant for including environmental laws, including the public trust doctrine. So if you could talk about that and the role that played in upholding the ability to pursue subsistence fishing and farming in the Waiahole area that we just talked about.
Sure, yes. The 1978 Constitution for the state of Hawaii is quite impressive. It's very inspiring, and I encourage people to take a look at it and try to adopt similar concepts in their own communities. The public trust doctrine is something that is weaved into the Constitution in multiple places. It recognizes that there are natural and cultural resources that are shared by everyone. They are not privately owned. So water, for example, in Hawaii cannot be privately owned. And that is a huge mind shift, because there is a mindset from the plantation days of sugar plantations of trying to control and own the water. And, one of the reasons why I think, the ConCon and the people who made up the ConCon, they were most of them were regular people. There was like a conscious effort made to not have career politicians be part of the Constitutional Convention. And so you had regular people who were grappling with these big policy issues. And one of the things they recognized is that they needed to basically free the water, free the streams from this, corporate control. We're still, it is a work in progress. We set out these huge goals, and we are still in the process of trying to get these streams restored. But it was an acknowledgement that, everything is part of a system. And when you undermine certain parts of the system, things really start to unravel and break down, right? So when sugar plantations diverted the streams of East Maui, for example, or Waiahole, it not only took the water away to the dry side of the island where they were growing the sugar, it also undermined taro cultivation on the wet side of the islands. And that also helped to unravel the social networks, the communal ties that made for a strong, healthy, safe community to live in. And I don't think that was by accident. I mean, we need to acknowledge that there were conscientious racist tendencies, right, to undermine the Hawaiian way of life. And the 1978 Constitution was an attempt to begin the rectification of that. And so some of the policies that the Sierra Club advocates for in Hawaii go to try to address the historical injustices, in addition to trying to just strengthen the farmer and strengthen the community of farmers as a whole, right? It is a system, it is a network. We all need to work together to make sure that we can do more than just survive, but actually thrive. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, we advocate for is trying to reach back and look at the successes of pre-contact Hawaii, especially in terms of agriculture and education, and try to pull forward those things that are relevant, marry them with, high-tech innovations, and bring together, really address and harness this new future, right? Climate change is going to confront us with challenges like we've never had before. But more than once, Hawaii has risen to the occasion. Whenever we are challenged, we do a good job of taking care of each other. And climate change is going to be the ultimate test. But I think that, working together with this mindset towards solutions and trying to rectify and correct past injustices, I actually have a lot of hope for the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marty. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that the ConCon organizers were a broad group of activists, but they did go on to become elected officials, didn't they? One of the key organizers, WWII, was a civil rights attorney at the time, but he went on to become a governor of Hawaii, and the only Hawaiian governor since statehood.
Yep. So, it jump-started several political careers, but I think it's important that it was, regular people, I think sometimes there's this mindset that, policy is something that's set, far and away from me, when in reality, it's us, we are directly dealing with these problems in our daily lives, and it should be us that engages and helps to inform those decisions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Paula.
Yeah, go ahead.
There was one little thing that I think Marty left out. Marty, I think you should talk about how, a lot of the public trust doctrine actually comes from old Hawaiian law. Can you?
This is true. This is true. So, pre-contact, there was no private property in the Hawaiian Islands. Everything was shared. The way in which resources were managed and distributed was, a konahiki who was charged with taking care of the health and well-being of the entire community. Just make sure that
a manager of the
konahiki. Yeah. So this person would make sure the stream water, went through the awai to the taro patches, so that everybody's taro patches got water. Would make sure that everyone had a house, had whatever healthcare they could get, and it was that kind of mindset that ensured that everybody was well cared for. And, it was well established that people could, you could go to the mountains to gather, you could go to the sea to gather, and you use these resources to enrich yourselves and your community, your family. And the 1978 Constitution intentionally pulled forward those concepts, right? Married it with some of the English concepts, the British concepts of common law, and the public commons, and but really the very fundamental foundation there is Hawaiian concepts of being able to take care of ourselves by sharing in the bounty of our islands, right? So that's part of the reason why beaches in Hawaii are public. You do not have the situation where you have privately owned beaches. It is because of the public trust doctrine. That is why a lot of our trails are public, and you can go there and you can gather. And I don't want to over simplify it. Like, there are challenges. Like I said, it's a work in progress. So we're constantly engaging with state government, who is trying to limit public access, limit people's abilities to fulfill on the public trust doctrine, and also, being accomplices in the privatization of public trust resources. And so the Sierra Club is constantly suing on behalf of streams, on behalf of beaches, to keep them open and keep them public. And to ensure that the public trust doctrine is actually effectuated in day-to-day decisions by the government.
But it's a very good point, and about it being preceded by Hawaiian values, there was a Supreme Court case in the Waiahole matter, which we maybe touched on, about the diversion of water from where Danny and Mayala farm over to the golf courses and so forth on the other side of the island. And the public trust doctrine came into play in upholding the rights of maintaining the water in the original place. And what I remember reading about in that case that really moved me quite a bit was the reference to the cultural values of Hawaii that had been embedded in the Constitution. So it was really important. And as you said, it was done at a time, 1978, where they were using the language available at the time. But that case has become resonant throughout the United States. I'm glad you all brought that up. So speaking of climate change, since you did raise that as well, Hawaii has had a real strong goal in renewable energy. Kaika, were you part of that?
No, not directly.
Energy. Oh, sorry, I saw that organizing. So but that's been a big push. So Hawaii has done a remarkable job in moving from the dependence on fossil fuel. So oil was being shipped to Hawaii at a rate of 90%, import of energy. So Hawaii really committed itself to a renewable energy goal. So we're thinking that Hawaii can commit itself as well to a renewable food system goal. And for that, I'm going to go to Ka'iana. So Ka'iana, we've been mentioning the 1978 ConCon, and one of the things that ConCon also did was establish Hawaiian as an official second language. It had been subject to erasure. I was not taught Hawaiian. My aunties who knew how to speak Hawaiian wouldn't speak it in public. It was a source of, as Mayala pointed out, it was not a part of the culture at the time I grew up. But then in 1978, it became an official language again. And now there's generations of Hawaiians that have been raised in immersion with the Hawaiian language and are more familiar with it. And it seems like you are somewhat fluent in Hawaiian and a farmer for the Kahala Center. Can you talk about the work you do and your experience of the language?
Yeah, mahalo, Eti Paula. So something that would wake, my kupuna would wake me up in my moi uhane if I didn't mention this. And I think this is important. Yeah. Is that the overthrow was illegal. And I think that's something we kind of maybe skimmed over. The current US military occupation is illegal according to international law. And so I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that and throw the palu, the bait out there for all of our friends who are not in Hawaii at this time to do some research and figure out why that is. But yeah, as far as the current food system goes, it's pretty shattered. I sit here on my window and I look out every day and I watch the ship come across this Moana Nui. Every Tuesday they come in, every Thursday they go out. And that's the 90% is what they say or so of the food that Hawaii is consuming. Is that food healthy? That's probably not, but that's an issue, right? Because any small thing can happen and that ship stops coming across that Moana, that ocean, and we're gonna have problems because we're on a moku, we're on an island, we're on our own ship in the middle of the sea. And so my kuleana in life, I feel,
your responsibility. Sorry, I'm going to interject.
Sorry, yeah. our responsibility in life is to feed. I'm a feeder. And so what I try to do is I try to use the Opio generation, the youth generation, as a ipuka, as a gate to get into the hale of a family. So I use the youth. I bring the youth in from this mokupuni to our aina, and I teach them how to grow food, and I grow a love for growing food. And then what eventually happens is then I bring in their makua, their parents, and then I bring in the kupuna, the grandparents and above. And I feel like when we teach families how to cultivate food and to cultivate a love for mahi'ai, for food cultivation, it is longer lasting. And, you know, Hawaii Island, at least where I am right now, Mokuo Keawe, we're in a very special location because we are the only island that has less people now than we did at the time of contact from foreigners. And so if we had the ability to feed every Kānaka then, every Hawaiian then, well, we have the ability to feed everyone on the island right now. But the problem is, you know, we've kind of lost that ability to grow this ono food. And so because we're short on time, and I know we don't have a lot of time here, what I want to do is narrow down what I do at the Kohala Center, and also more importantly in my own personal life with my ohana. I want to narrow it down to 3 things that we do to help our OPO, our youth generation, know what's most important here. And that's the first step in helping our youth is something I wish I had earlier in life, and that's decolonizing the mind. So getting back our olelo, like you mentioned, you know, the tongue in Hawaii is a very important thing. Not only is it what we use for our language, but it also determines what we eat, right? Our tongue is how we taste things. So changing the palate of our Hawaiians to appreciate these traditional foods again, that our body digests the best, because we've digested it for, you know, many generations. Our bodies don't respond to things like white rice and pasta and bread, as well as they do to a complex carbohydrate that's fermented, like Auntie mentioned, in the form of poi. And so getting them back to that is important, but also shattering that school to prison pipeline, that school to the US military pipeline. Our youth should not be fighting for a foreign military. They should be growing food for our people and for their families here in Hawaii. It never made sense to me why we use this piece of paper as a transaction to go and purchase food that was grown somewhere else. I think that we should be growing our food and cutting out the middleman, that piece of paper. So that's step 1, decolonizing the mind. Step 2, I would say, is connecting this rising hanauna, this rising generation, to their mo'okuauhau, to their genealogy. Because once they know where they come from, now they can know where they're going. They have a clearer view of the future. Connecting them to Aina, who's also our kupuna. Connecting land, Aina is land. Connecting them to the kai, to the ocean, and the resources like Auntie Miela talked about that's there, the abundance that's there. And all of this starts with access to Aina and to vai, to fresh water. You know, the sugarcane industry did a feat here on this side of the island, on Mokuo Keawe, on Hawaii Island, where they took all the water from flowing vertical and they cut it across the land to flow horizontal. So what does that mean for everyone that lives below that water line? No more vai, no more vai, no more mea'ai, no more food, yeah? And so getting Hawaiians back on land is so critical and so important. And we got to do it from the bottom up, because we tried from the top down, right? Bill Clinton in '93 apologized for the illegal overthrow, but he never do nothing about it. So Maikai, we got to do them ourselves, right? And so starting from the bottom and creating these organic movements to get Kānaka together, even if I got to share my land, come, grow food. We live together, and that's how we can slowly reclaim it, because no can rely on America anymore. Yeah, the Queen tried, and Governor Cleveland was going to acknowledge it, but it didn't work out. And so, just pooling resources, reclaiming Aina however necessary, I think is the most important thing right now for us, and growing just organic food that our keiki can thrive off. So that's just some things that I wanted to highlight. Mahalo for everything that was said. It raised so many good questions, but solutions based. I'm just starting at the OPO level and trying to enter the family there and get them to grow food. We don't want to grow more concrete buildings, and we don't want to grow tourism, you know. And speaking of tourism, we're going to transition there in a second.
Yeah.
My little blurb for tourism is, you know, we were always raised with the saying, leave the place better than you found them, right? And so if you are a malihini, a visitor coming to Hawaii, just make sure you leave this aina better than you found it, yeah? Don't cake yourself up with sunscreen and go into the kai and step on the new coral polyps, yeah? Just be more understanding of this place and how fragile it really is, you know, and come to the mala, get a real Hawaiian experience on the mala, and don't forget pull weeds on your way out. And you can taste the poi, and it may not be ono, but it's going to be good for you. And yeah, that's my little mahalo, Auntie Paula.
Yeah, Kaiana, this is why you are the future of Hawaii. But the poi actually is ono or delicious. My mom used to make it for breakfast, but she'd put like sugar and milk on it. So, you know, that was what they did in the 60s. And now I've learned how to eat it by itself, and it's really wonderful. A lot of you would like it with salsa, I would think.
Oh.
So that is a perfect segue, Kaiana, because the last topic I wanted to address, yeah, Danny.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that myself.
Okay, yeah. But the last topic I wanted to address with everybody is tourism, but also wanted to bring it back to Danny and Meala, because you're back on the land, on the Aina, you're growing kalo. So if you want to have any words before we move to this topic of regenerative tourism, which is a hot topic in Hawaii these days.
I'm just so grateful for what everybody said so far. They've touched a lot of spots, brought up a lot of good topics. The distribution of wealth, the illegal overthrow, healing of the waters. Our history is our past history is wrought with a lot of depressing facts that actually benefited a very few that lived in Hawaii at the time. So I'm looking forward to listening to more from the other presenters than I am.
Danny, you're a generous man. But I will say, just for more resources, Kaiana's call was to research about the overthrow. And you can actually just find it in Wikipedia. It's there, but there's also many books and stories that have written on that. And we can maybe put a list together and see if that can be circulated later. But it is, in fact, the case that Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, did declare it illegal and ordered the provisional government that kicked my great-great-grandfather out of office to stand down, and they wouldn't. And then it got caught in political stalemate after that. Let's just say it was the Gilded Era, and there was a political divide, and it got caught in that. But there's a lot more to learn about that, and we'd be happy to provide resources on that. For now, though, let's talk about going forward, because with the COVID last year and the halt to tourism, Hawaii took a big economic hit and is running a deficit now. The population of Hawaii itself is about 1.4 million now. And in 2019, there were 10 million tourists a year. There were 250,000 visitors to Hawaii per day. So Hawaii's tourism economy was really huge. And during the cessation of tourism, it was a pause, and it seemed like there was an opportunity for folks to think about what reopening could mean. Although I hear that lots of people are going to Hawaii now. I'm going tomorrow or soon, and the car rentals are out of this world. So what does regenerative tourism, which is the word that's being, in conversation Hawaii, what does that mean to you all? And what do you think, how it can be managed going forward? I appreciated Kaiana's point about leaving a place better than you found it, and understanding and respecting it. And some of the Hawaii Tourism Authority recommendations are to bring more connection to the culture of Hawaii. Any thoughts you all have on that?
I have a thought real quick. I think that the first thing that Hawaii can do, at least on the political level, is just cap the number of people that can come at a certain time. I think that Hawaii can only handle so many people. And when you're bringing in the millions, it's like, whoa, the island cannot breathe. And so I would say cap the number of people that can reside on the island from foreign places at a time. I would also say that they should rotate where people can and can't go. Put kapus on places. Give places breaks.
Boundary.
Yeah. So like so like Kahalu'u Bay right now is giving breaks to the ocean, and the polyps there are all coming back, and the I'a are coming closer, and it's healing. And so I would say rotating where they can and can't go, and then also making sure they spend time on Aina and helping out farmers in Mahi'ai to get a real Hawaiian experience, not a Disneyland, fire knife hula experience per se, but like an actual, legit Hawaiian experience.
Like an ecotourism experience, like when they go to Italy or to France and they're on a vineyard kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Something similar to that. And just making sure that the only people that benefit from tourists is not the people who benefit financially from tourists, because that's a very small group of people that benefit a lot from tourism, where the rest are left hanging. Yeah.
Anybody else?
I would just add that, to Kaiana's point, that the people who are benefiting from tourism financially are also not from here, right? So we have a lot of foreign investment, and I would like to see shifts made in policy that ensure that the money spent by tourists here stays here. We should, local ownership of our of the hotels and the accommodations for tourists is, we in addition to all of the things that he said, a cap, kapus, those are all great ways to minimize the harm. It really is a harmful industry.
I mean, a lot of people on the call are probably tourists and planning to go to Hawaii. So you are welcome. Just know that there are these issues that we're grappling with in Hawaii. And when the food system can be part of it, because one of the recommendations is that there be more local food purchased in the tourism industry, right?
That'd be okay. I think, Auntie Mel Ala had her hand up.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. I really feel like our culture has been really used in this tourist idea. We spend so much time exploring. So even ecotourism doesn't sit well with me. Grants, foundations, all these things that just keep us in this exploration stage. And the people, the Kānaka Maoli themselves, are not able to use our culture to ourselves if we're only going to luau, playing our music, doing the hula, showing people this is what a lo'i is or a taro patch, when actually our people need to just get on the land, have their own parcels, grow their own food. And the bottom line is not the dollar or how much we can improve the tourism here. We need to get our people back on the land and farming, and enough with the exploration. We know what to do in order to grow our food. And I just want to actually thank everybody with the ride we've made in the last decade in food, in justice. And I hope that Hawaii will grow and be able to just take care of ourselves and not be so worried about the tourism that come to visit here.
Yeah, Oia kamea nui. I mean, I think the question about whether tourists should come and partake in Hawaiian culture, that's fine. I'm not going to say no, but the people who really need to know our culture are Hawaiians. That is the primary objective. Hawaiians need to know our culture. Tourists should support by being, in solidarity with us politically. I think that's important. They're welcome to be in solidarity with us economically. Sure, we would welcome that. And part of my feeling on this is that if you look at the economics of tourism, like what Marty was saying, in Waikiki, 0 hotels in Waikiki are locally owned. These are hotels that are owned by private equity firms, operating out of Wall Street. The benefit, the capital benefit, the accrual of wealth and of the ownership of those properties does not come to Hawaii. The only benefit, frankly, is in the jobs. And what we're seeing right now is, as hotels reopen, they're not hiring workers back, and so it's poho. It's like a waste. If they're not going to hire local people to go work in those hotels, then what is the value of tourism? The value of tourism should be primarily in the jobs, But I think the question of culture should be, how do we reconnect to our past so that we can connect to our future?
Mm-hmm.
May I?
Thank you. And yeah, and then we're going to turn to audience questions after that.
I'll try to keep it brief then, because during the COVID, a miracle happened. The residents of Hawaii got to enjoy Hawaii. So I grew up in Waikiki in the 60s and the 70s, and it was still a little village. There were very few hotels. There was mostly housing, and the hippies were in town. So it was a really beautiful thing. Can't go back to Waikiki anymore. It's oppressive. It's dirty. It's noisy. I'm back there. The tourists that I see coming now seem to be not the older retired folks that have worked a long time to come to see paradise. They seem to be privileged younger people who come with the idea of challenging themselves, the idea of risk taking, the idea of privilege. And I believe that our marketing people in the tourism industry are actually looking forward to bringing more upper middle class people, which means to me more intrusion and privileged people. So I'm very skeptical about the future of tourism, because I don't think the government is going to take reality, the government here, the real cause and effects of high intensity tourism. They just want money back.
Well, audience, you're getting an unvarnished view. You're hearing some truth telling today about the concerns, and there's a lot to balance there, because tourism is the biggest economic driver in Hawaii right now. So I think, taking in all these considerations that you've heard, there are folks who are looking at that idea of regenerative tourism and how can we manage it in a way that respects all of these concerns and welcomes everyone who wants to come respectfully. And to understand Hawaii in the way that you all are, because you're on this webinar, and the fact that you are means that you're already very interested and want to know more. And that's exactly what we would invite. And hopefully there will be more opportunities to know how to engage. So some of the questions that I'm seeing from the callers is, how are there land trusts working toward rebuilding ahupua'a that landowners can deed their land to? So let me just explain ahupua'a, which Marty touched on. It was a unit of governance. It was quite innovative in that it was a unit of governance. She mentioned the konohiki, the managers were given. It went from the waterfalls to the ocean, and everything was governed according to that. So that's the watershed is the ahupua'a. So the question is, are there land trusts working toward rebuilding that? Anybody?
There's the Hawaii Island Land Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that works to facilitate conservation and agricultural easements on private property to try to keep those lands green, basically. There's also the Trust for Public Land has an local office here, and they do very similar work. And the Sierra Club works closely with them on, trying to add value to, interpretive value to some of these land protection projects. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for people not from Hawaii to invest in Hawaii. If you are, captured by the amazing ambiance and nature of Hawaii and the people, the culture, you should follow that feeling and try to do what you can. I mean, like, for example, my family came to Hawaii as part of the U.S. military occupation, and this is the only home I've ever known. But I'm very conscious of trying to always address the harms that the U.S. military has caused here. Not so much that I should just never come to Hawaii and not be engaged because the U.S. military has a bad history here, but instead to actually be corrective and helpful. And so I feel like, if people are moved to come to Hawaii and visit Hawaii, recognize that the Hawaii Tourism Authority may have not given you proper expectations, and you should educate yourself, and you should make a point to really try to connect with the place. And you do have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that you do, like Kaiana said, leave the place better than you found it.
Something that I want to add to that, because I don't work on that kind of larger political level, is what I've been doing is just talking to my neighbors at the very top of my ahupua'a and the neighbors at the very bottom, and connecting everyone in between. So we can do them, we can still have our own places, but we're doing them with one mindset. And, nobody above me spraying the poison and like nobody below me. We just malama everything and we share everything. And we could do them on that small scale as well. And then I just wanted to make sure we highlight the successes too, like good things are happening too. Like Hawaii has a deep history of pain and hurt, but good things are happening too. My students going home and establishing these immaculate gardens and keeping them running for years now. That's a success story. That families are becoming food secure. That's a success story. And the more and more we can have these little successes, as a whole, we start growing that. And, hopefully one day we only see the ship coming across the Moana maybe like once every few months. That would be a dream to me. But yeah, just wanted to celebrate successes too.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ka'iaina. And that actually dovetails with a question from the audience. What is the brightest star you see on the horizon for Hawaii's food system? Each of you in your work, what's the brightest star and what looks like a promise to reclaim the food system and restore justice?
Is to get more parcels in the hands of the Hawaiian people so they can grow their own food and share with their neighbors and not have to worry that the only way they're going to get the lease is the bottom line is going to be $1 because you have a monocrop of all papayas. We don't believe in that. We believe in diversified farming where you have a little bit of everything. So to sustain you completely and help your neighbors. Because most of our leases that we have, they want you to have some bottom line of making money to help the economy, but it doesn't help the people.
If I might also, the brightest star are the youth. The youth of the generation, Kaiana's generation, have been raised with truth. And through truth, they're seeking justice. And justice not in a painful sense, but justice in educating themselves, involving themselves with environment, with family, with community. It's very exciting time for me.
Yeah, I want to echo Uncle Danny, that I'm really excited by this decade. I think because of people's awareness around climate change and all of the uncertainties that brings forward for everyone in Hawaii, but globally, I think people are realizing this is a decade of incredible shifts and evolution, hopefully, in how we live and how we work together. I'm really interested in how we combine food production with, how do we combine our traditional, ancient, well-established ways of doing engineering here in Hawaii that results in incredible abundance. Things like the Auai system, the aqueduct system, our taro patches, our native fish ponds, which are really amazing technologies, and combining that with all the wondrous things that the 21st century offers, and for us to bring those together in an economic model, which is more inclusive, more cooperative, and that can actually lead us to a much more prosperous, 2030s, 2040s, 2050s.
I also have similar hope for this decade. Just in the experience of COVID, seeing the people of Hawaii rise to the occasion really gave me hope for the future when there was a time there where I was a little low on hope. Two very concrete examples. One, the rise of local food hubs, which has become really a great way to help connect farmers to eaters and has really helped to they served a huge purpose because we have, such economic vulnerability here that we had long food lines. We still do have long food lines. And the local food hubs helped to ensure that it was local farmers, local food farmed here locally that was distributed to people who were in need. And that was a great model. And that hui is now growing. I mean, it's like a dozen locations and it's getting bigger and bigger every day. Another one was,
hui means group. You said
hui means group, sorry. Yes. And then another one is food stamps. So the people of Hawaii came up with this idea of doubling the value of food stamps when they're used at local farmers markets. And so, people would go to farmers markets, which sometimes are presented as like hoity-toity, like fancy, high mucka, food, very expensive. But if in actuality, when you go there, like local farmers are able to get value for their food that's grown here. And then the local people will be able to get very nutritious, locally grown food. And it was just like a win-win situation. And I think it just goes to show that when we're put in a stressed position and we're forced to find a solution that benefits everyone, we can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, we don't speak English. Haimaka maka means ostentatious, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, I mean, they know I know, so yeah, so it's a good translation. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that Double Up Bucks program, Marty, because that's something that was started and is now part of the Farm Bill, but Hawaii has embraced it really fully, and that's a really good program. It's a permanent part of the Farm Bill. I think there's 250 million in it now for the nation. But,
yeah, it's a great way of showing how you can take this federal money from outside and really like double down on it locally to reinforce things, right? Because it's building in that resiliency. Right now, we'll have more and more farmers growing more and more local food. People are healthier because they're not eating imported rice and whatever. And it's like when we do get in that stress situation where the ships are not delivering, we will have better infrastructure to help provide for people.
Mm-hmm. It's actually it's a disguised carbon tax. That's what it is. Right?
I guess so.
No, in a way, well, it does reorder subsidies. It puts subsidies in the right place, which is to help support the purchase of food that is not already subsidized and therefore is more expensive because it bears its true cost. It's not an externalized cost. So that's the value of that program. And the other thing about the food hubs, from what I understand, is in addition to getting food to food insecure populations during COVID, they actually gave some jobs to folks who'd been displaced because of the halt in the tourism industry. So it's a really good model that's building across the United States, but I think has a lot of momentum in Hawaii and is definitely a bright spot.
Kaiana, I don't know, Kaiana, do you have a North Bright Star or whatever the thing you're looking forward to?
Yeah, mahalo. The brightest star is definitely our OPO. It's our youth. Because I get to work with them so often. I get to see they're gonna shake the kumunu and drop some big coconuts soon. You can tell because they're just so inspired, and you can tell the people that come that I'm around, the youth, they have mental sovereignty. They're strengthening their food sovereignty. So political sovereignty is right down the road. I mean, come on, that's the natural next step, right? Once we're food sovereign, the rest is easy to me. And so, I would say the bright stars is the OPO, that youth generation.
Which you are leading so well. And that leads to one last audience question, which is on, is there a conversation with the Native American community, the tribes on the continent, about how to gain similar legal status and rights? And I'll tee that off by just saying, and you all can comment on that, but there was a bill that was introduced by Hawaii Senator Akaka a while ago in the 90s during the Bush administration to have recognition of the Hawaiian peoples, and it never passed. It was always caught in different sorts of issues. It was even supported by President Barack Obama at one point. So there's that piece of information. I see Kaiana has some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. No, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a sensitive subject. No, that's ridiculous. We're not American. Why would we be in a tribe under the American banner? We're Hawaiian nationals, and so under an illegal occupation. So I would say that, everywhere they went to try to introduce that bill, legitimately, every single person testified against it in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Very not unlike the Ku'e petitions, right, that went around. So that I don't necessarily think we have a ton. I won't speak for Native American cousins because I don't know their political status, but what I understand is ours is a little bit different, and I support them in however we can, but we're different, I think, as well.
It's a different.
If I could just jump in, I feel like the thing more important than that, probably and more immediate, is land back. Like we need to make every effort in every community we live in to give land back to Native populations. And yeah, there's many opportunities to do that here in Hawaii and throughout North America.
I mean, they paid $1 for Pearl Harbor. I'm sure it's worth more than $1, right? And they've never paid for the cleanup of Pearl Harbor, which is full of Superfund sites. They've never paid for the back rent on areas like Pearl Harbor, Makua Valley, Schofield, Fort Shafter, all of these lands. And so before we have any conversation about a political, like a shakeup in our political status, which we've always asserted that there was no treaty of annexation, there's no right for the United States to take over Hawaii, and we've never acceded to the United States as the power here. We've never agreed to that. We've been very clear. So let's talk about the money first. Let's talk about the back rent. Let's talk about the cleanup costs of all these things, and have that funnel towards the programs that we currently have: Department of Hawaiian Homelands, Hawaiian language programs, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, etc. Let's support more farmers, and then we can talk about the policy, the actual political status later.
Mm-hmm. So I said this is a time for truth telling. So we do have time for one last question, and we have a minute for this. But is there any effort to incorporate more traditional foods in the schools in Hawaii, and how is that being received by the students?
So there is a movement here locally. One of the first struggles is to get around the Food Security Act, or that not food security, food safety legislation.
FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act.
Food Safety Modernization Act. So it is a hurdle that it is a challenge, but we're finding that as time progresses, and as native foods and native practices or culturally respected practices are being recognized as the future way of growing food, then the corporate mentality of food safety is diminishing, and local organic food growing processes are more acceptable.
And I would say that charter school process, they have been able to make their own menus and incorporate a lot of our local foods into it. And they're also starting to hook up with farmers that will supply them with cultural foods. So hopefully the public school system will be able to latch on to that, and we'll see more of that in our public schools.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep. There are robust school garden programs and farm to school programs. There's the Āina Pono program and the Department of Education, and they've had pilot projects in Kauai and on Big Island too. And they've been able to introduce locally grown foods, the Ulu Cooperative. So there's a lot of examples, I think, here locally of successful school food programs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. Any last 1 or 2 words before I turn it over to Corby?
I'm so glad there's a big interest in the social injustices of Hawaii, and I hope everybody will Google any of these great words you've been hearing to learn more about our plight and how we have grown.
Kaiana.
Yeah, I just want to say mahalo. It's not an anti any national thing. Some of my best friends are Americans, but it's really just a time for telling truth and coming up with solutions. So mahalo for listening. And yeah, like Auntie Mala said, if you're ever bored, do some research. It's a pretty intriguing topic, and we're living it. So mahalo.
Marty.
Yes, immense gratitude. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and look for opportunities in the future to support both local food in your community as well as local food in Hawaii. Yes, thank you.
Any Kaika.
I guess just thank you very much to everyone, to Paula and to all the team. That the teams have actually people that made this possible, and to all the folks who are watching this in America, we welcome allyship, and we welcome your support and involvement in solidarity with our work, and I think we would love to find ways to support what you're doing as well. So please let us know, if there's opportunities to for us to collaborate and work together, cooperate together.
All right, and I'll join in thanking all of you for being on the panel and for sharing your stories, your information, your truths, and your views. It's a very important part of a rich and layered conversation that is important to have. And also thank the audience for listening, and thank I have no idea how I got muted, but I am now going to turn it over to Corby Kummer, the Executive Director, Food and Society of the Aspen Institute, to close us out.
What an impassioned conversation. We knew from our many preparations. So
Corby, you're muted.
we knew from our many preparation sessions that the guests were so generous in attending that we would have an extraordinary moderator at Paula Daniels. But wow, did we have impassioned guests. Marty, the bishops, Ikaika, and I'm so relieved that some of Kayana's best friends are Americans, but what we all learned, how inspired we all were. The team at Share Our Strength, Elliot Gaskins and Julie McNulty, are extraordinary to work with. Our own team with Tracy Anderson make this all go incredibly smoothly, but we all learn, and we invite you to learn with us. The links for the video and a summary to action will be on our website and available next week. And please stay tuned on our websites, because we're very excited about next month's conversation on food justice. Our topic is food insecurity and mental health, the silent, devastating impacts on children and families. We're really looking forward to that. And then we'll be back at Labor Day. But so many resources, so much inspiring material that all of us live by and live for. Thank you to all our panelists and our partners for today's conversation, and especially to you for joining us. Please join us again.